Before we begin today's live conversation with Max Porter, which occurred in May at Powell's bookstore in downtown Portland, I wanted to provide a little background. For one, Max has been on the show before for his book Lanny almost exactly 4 years ago. And as I know you can all relate, that 4 years feels more like 4 lifetimes ago in so many ways. I was still at the radio station. Max and I met in person like I did for every conversation back then. And I even drove him back to his hotel afterwards. And we kept in touch a little bit after our time together, infrequently, haphazardly. But he reached out to say how moved he was by the conversation with Teju Cole. And he sent me a remarkable book by the British art historian T.J. Clark called Heaven on Earth, Painting in the Life to Come. And last year, when I was interested in seeing if P.J. Harvey would want to be on Between the Covers to talk about her book of poetry written in the near extinct dialect of Dorset, Max was in conversation with Harvey about this very book in England, so I reached out to him to see if he might plant a seed on my behalf. And he went even further and reached out to the Scottish poet Dawn Patterson, who Harvey mentored herself under. And Patterson reached out to the press about Between the Covers. So seeing Max once again in person, having another conversation on the other side of the pandemic lockdown, sharing the same space again, was an exciting prospect and also a significant marking of time. And his new book, Shy, while a standalone book, like all of his books, is also the third book in what some consider his trilogy of childhood or trilogy of boyhood. If you haven't read his previous books in the triptych, Grief is the Thing with Feathers and Lanny, a couple times today I reference figures from them, most notably the crow in his debut, and the figure Dead Papa Toothwort in Lanny. Both of them are mythic figures that interact with and influence the story of the humans in those books. So if you hear me in passing mention either, I wanted you to know that these are figures not in the latest book Shy, but in the books that precede it. The first time Max was on the show, he contributed a reading of a poem of his to the bonus audio archive. The singer-songwriter Joan Shelley had reached out to Max to express her love for his writing, and they started corresponding, and this is a poem he wrote to her and for her as part of that. Since then, he's written the lyrics of songs for her and for others. Singers from Bonnie Prince Billy, otherwise known as Will Oldham, to Feist have used his words to make songs. And shortly after our time together, he was headed to Canada as part of his book tour to be in conversation with Feist about Shy. Since we last talked, his first book was adapted to the stage, starring Cillian Murphy, and it was announced that it was also going to be adapted to the screen, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. And if you haven't read Max's work, one of the first things you'll encounter as we discuss it today are all of these other influences outside of prose, of poetry, of theater, of visual art, of music, that change not only the way the words are composed in Max's books, but also how they look on the page and more. The crowd today was decidedly artistic and literary. The author and head of Future Tense Books, Kevin Samsel, was there. Many past guests on the show found early success with Future Tense, including Chelsea Hodson, Genevieve Hudson, and Alyssa Washuda. The novelist Patrick DeWitt was there, probably best known for the book The Sisters Brothers, but also who has a new book, The Librarianist, coming out this year. So if you hear Max mention Patrick during the talk tonight, he's referencing their time together earlier that same day. I should also mention that Max was in the middle of listening to the Christina Sharp episode of Between the Covers, when we talked. So that conversation also enters today's conversation multiple times because it's on Max's mind. Laura Moulton, the head of Street Books, was in the audience, the bicycle-powered mobile library serving people who live outside, which you can find out more about at streetbooks.org. And the novelist with Small Beer Press, Kelly Link's Press, Ben Parzybach, was there, who was on the show for his novel Sherwood Nation, and who also asks the first audience question near the end of today's episode. I'm confident that no one left disappointed, as this conversation was rich, deep, wide-ranging, funny, and philosophical. If you want to hear Max's poem, which I'm sure you will after hearing him read in this episode today, and to learn about the innumerable other things in the bonus audio archive, and to check out the many other possible benefits of becoming a listener supporter by joining the Between the Covers community, head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's episode with none other than Max Porter.
Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Max Porter. He is the author of Grief is the Thing with Feathers, winner of the International Dylan Thomas Prize, The Death of Francis Bacon, and Lanny, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and less prestigiously, maybe, was my own personal pick for the best book of 2019. I don't do that every year. I'm very lazy with my awards, so, I think that makes it even more prestigious, but you be the judge. I'm excited about the new book. So is the brilliant novelist George Saunders, who says, Max Porter is one of my favorite writers in the world. Why? Because he's always asking the most important questions and then finding ways through innovative structures and that inimitable voice of answering those questions soulfully with his full attention in ways that make the world seem stranger and more dear, or more dear because stranger. He gives his readers, in other words, bursts of new vision. I love that blurb. The wonderful musician PJ Harvey says, Max Porter has a way of writing unlike anyone else. I loved Shy. I finished it elated and tearful, joyful and terrified, changed by the journey. It moved me and surprised me, and that is what I look for in my favorite artists. I don't think I've read a blurb by PJ Harvey before, I've got to say. So that's high praise from someone who doesn't give it out freely. Joining our author tonight, we are delighted to welcome David Naiman. He is the author of the Between the Covers podcast, which at this point is this incredible archive of over a decade of interviews with authors. It's been praised by The Guardian and Book Riot, and author Gary Steingart calls it the most intense and awesome podcast I've ever been a part of. Now, he does do a lot of blurbs, so, take that as it goes. Please welcome Max Porter and David Naiman.
Hi, Max.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for doing this. What an honor.
So are we starting with a reading before we talk?
Sure.
Okay, great.
You are a nice boy. We live in a nice okay. That's not it. I'll start again. These are drugs for pain medication, Shy. These are drugs your Nana had when she was dying. What pain are you in that you need these drugs? Talk to me. I beg you, talk to me. Or do you just like getting fuzzy and lost? Is that what it is? Are you being pressured into it? Is it Sean? Are you being pressured into taking these drugs? Just talk to me. I beg you. Why no owls? He wonders, why no twit-twoos in the dark woods behind the house, no breeze. He's heading into bluey still nothingness. Everything seems behind him in a clump. A fug, last chance, before that, slowed down, sped up. Seems like years since he moved here. Seems like yesterday he left primary school and went back 1 year later and laughed at how small and low the urinals were. Urinals. Sorry. He felt so big and grown up leaving primary, little muppet. Time's been the least reliable fucker these last few years. He locks horns with the hours of the day, with what's happening just behind him, with the big hot pressure of next. Time is something to get wasted and escape from. He is bullied by time, lied to, hemmed in and taunted. Best to pass out and wake up further down the line. The end of the world! Not getting a coach to Milton Keynes to go dancing and take ease with his friends. That's what set him off. Imagine! No resilience. It's a spoiled apocalypse all day long, every day. You are a stupid, lucky bastard, Shy. You are a lucky little bastard pretending you're hard. Look at your crash net. A mum who loves you, a good stepdad, food, care, this place, me. Amanda, Owen, not prison. You had all these chances, eh? It wasn't so easy for the others, was it? You've seen how this country works. Police. Judges. Walk a mile in Benny's shoes, yeah? Don't take the piss, all right? Yeah? Hello? Earth to Shy? Don't pretend you can't hear me. Don't pretend you can't hear me. Shut, all right. Headphones off, Shy, yeah? It's very rude. We had enough of this. This music's very fast, very metallic, very choppy. It's very on, Shy. We need you off, yeah? Earth to Shy. He stops and looks about and feels very alone, very small, very ignorant, humbled by a thick, sudden worry. He needs to crack on. Don't let the overthinking strangle in. Little ideas left to grow unmanageable in the massive gabba hanger of his night terrors. Worries in the dance! Huge sound system mashing out any other noise. He's paranoid and thirsty. Well, don't go night raving with a backpack of flints. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. But have you ever thought of your mum as a human being outside you? Do you know that the lake of depression you've been describing falling into is a lake that your mum knows quite well? She's been climbing out of that lake, Shy. And now she's seeing you run tumbling in. Is anything I'm saying interesting you at all, Shy? Shy? When his mum said she'd gone and bought a pack of number ones, and he could have those cigarettes, and he could even smoke those cigarettes at home in a driveway, so long as he put the butts in the wheelie bin, on the condition that he sit down and watch a holiday video with her and Ian. And he agreed. So she gave him the fags, and he went out and he smoked one, and he came in and he joined them in the living room, and Ian had his camcorder box down from the loft, and the VHS tapes labelled all neat in their cases, and Ian popped in Water Sprinkler Charmouth 86. And they watched the video, and little Shy went pegging it off into the sea, and his mum laughed, and Ian laughed, and Shy hopped and skipped in the shallows and pegged it back, and then he tapped at a rock with his special hammer, but he didn't find a fossil. And then Ian flew a kite while his mum laughed at him, and then his mum ran down to the sea and squealed at the cold and ran back laughing, shouting, "Turn it off, Ian! Turn it off, you bugger!" And then Ian did a commentary on Shy lifting stones. Surely not. Surely the young lad's not going to get a boulder of that size up and off the, "Ooh, crikey, Mikey, he's gone and done it! Benjamin's mate!" Unbelievable scenes here at the world's strongest boy competition. And then it cuts to the back garden later that summer, and Shy is in his Spidey suit. Too small, short on his skinny wrists and ankles, wet and clinging to him, and he is leaping through the sprinkler. And as he reaches Ian, he star jumps and shouts, "Born!" into the camcorder lens, and he runs away and he sings, "In the USA!" And he turns at the end of the garden by the greenhouse, and he comes back again, leaping through the sprinkler, "Born!" sprinting up the garden, "In the USA!" again and again, and Ian is chuckling. And you can hear Jill and Michael and his mum in the background chatting and laughing, and the tape ends, and his mum says, "See? That wasn't so hard." And Shy says, "Don't fucking bother, Mum." And Ian says, hey, hang on a minute. And Shy says, "You can get lost, Ian." And Ian says, "Whoa there." And Shy imitates him, "Whoa there." And he kicks the box of tapes across the living room floor and leaves into the hallway, slamming the door to the overlapping sounds of "Here we go again. And we can't win. And come back here this second and let him go." And he has the song stuck in his head as he skulks around the park, smoking and spitting and feeling boring. And that's all he knows, just that bit. He doesn't know the rest of the song.
Well, first, just let me say how excited, I think I could speak for all of us, that you have a 3-city American tour and you've chosen Portland as one of those towns. So Thank you for that. And speaking of threes, other people have framed 3 of your 4 books as a trilogy of boyhood. And it's something that you've welcomed. You've seen that framing as a potentially useful for you as a framing. I don't want to say that there's something more dark about this book, because I would say that losing a parent when you're a child is really dark. But there's something about Shai as a character where you could imagine if the wrong things happen, he could end up in the gutter, or he could end up in a prison. He's at a really crucial juncture in his life, and he's pretty outside of normative society, I guess we could say at this point. Your description of him in the book, a child who has sprayed, snorted, smoked, sworn, stolen, cut, punched, run, jumped, crashed an escort, smashed up a shop, trashed a house, broken a nose. So maybe we could just start with you orienting us or introducing us.
You missed out that he stabbed his stepdad's finger.
Is that
That's really important,
It's important.
in his CV.
Well, why don't you introduce us to Shai, and also to why Shai? Why is Shai the boy of the third part of your boyhood trilogy?
Well, first, I just want to say how nice it is to be in Powell's and in Portland, and to be with you. You've been in my ears so much. And for those of you that listen to the podcast, you'll know that they're of such length and such depth and such integrity and such detail that you are fully immersed in them when you're in them. And so you've been living with me in the UK, and that's the miracle of the technology, of course, but also the miracle of your attention. So thank you. It's an honor. The thing with the trilogy or the triptych is that I fetishize triptychs and love them. So I'm a bit like a painter who just knocked off 3 pictures, and then the gallerist says, "It's a triptych, isn't it, darling?" And you go, "Does that sell for more?" Yeah, it's great. Yeah. Do people collect triptychs? Yeah. But also, of course, that they're patterned across the whole in ways that writers mean and then don't mean. So I'm pleased with that patterning. For me, why I wrote this book accidentally, or sort of in a storm. It poured out of me following a few projects that became other things, or collaborations that were ongoing, and then a book that I put in the drawer because my agent said it was too dark, and it was too dark, or it was too angry, and it was about the English, and it was a heartbroken book about a country I believe is broken and doesn't necessarily need to be, and is enacting various different types of violence upon its citizens and others in a way that I think is unnecessary and heartbreaking. But I hadn't done enough with it, and my agent was right. It was just pure. It was bitter and anger. So I was wondering what to do next, and then I had a strange encounter in the woods, and various things happened, and I'd been working with some young people, and then Shai just erupted. And so I sort of had to ask myself afterwards, why Shai? I think it's partly, as my American publisher Grey Wolf pitch it, is that what happens to boyhood lostness, what happens to the existential condition of the kind of cul-de-sac of shame and rage, and also a teenage condition ordinarily, but also in the Anthropocene. Where does one get one's answers from? Particularly if the overriding condition for boys is that you are a pseudo abuser. You are a proto violence in boy form, and you are pure risk, but you're also drenched in shame. So Shai is the kind of clueless beneficiary of various forms of injustice and violence and white supremacy and all sorts. And where does that leave him, other than with a vocabulary of just guilt and shame? And he's also part of that sea of we have an epidemic of male suicide here in the UK. I think here as well, and the numbers are really extraordinary, but also boys are failing in various different ways. And I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in ways that literature can approach something deemed to be ugly or lost and apply a certain type of attention, maybe a poetic attention to it. But also I love him, and I have loved him, and I have lost, as we all have, lost someone like Shai. And I was interested in this act of retrieval, also a non-judgmental way. So if my first book was about trying to write about mourning with ecstasy, not getting better, not being fixed, but the ongoing use of pain as love, then this was the same thing. This was how to approach someone who wants to take their own life or end their own life and bathe it in a kind of understanding. And that was a beautiful thing for me as a writer to work on, because I realized I was going to be more or less wholly absent, or certainly some of the techniques I developed as a writer were going to be unnecessary or irrelevant. So he came from simultaneously a technical and emotional impulse of mine.
Well, let's stay with masculinity a little bit longer. So I went to your Wikipedia page. I don't know if this is correct, but
I don't know who did it. I think maybe AI did it.
Really?
It certainly doesn't bear much relation to me, but what did you find?
Yeah, no, even if it's wrong, and I'd be curious if it is wrong, I want to connect this to something that I think runs through your books. So on the Wikipedia page, it says that after you studied art history, you got an MA in an improbable trio, another triptych, of radical performance art.
Oh, this is true, yeah.
Psychoanalysis and feminism.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I think about...
They're easy bedfellows, are they not?
So when I think about those, and I think about, I was just listening to you on a parenting podcast called Brown Baby, and the episode is Max Porter and the Dickhead Dads. You have 3 boys,
Yeah.
and you're talking with the interviewer about the different challenges of being a father, particularly in this era, but also just in any era, being a father, and about boyhood, and about a whole bunch of questions about masculinity. And so I was wondering, thinking about that, thinking about this trio not just being a trio of childhood, because it is a trio or triptych of childhood, but it is a triptych about masculinity also. So how would you characterize any animating questions specific to masculinity? And would you, as I suspect you probably would, connect this back to feminism in some fashion?
You do this, a combination of research and aggressive insight, for which we're all so grateful you're the recipients of it. Well, some of it is to do with the books as sort of anti-denial mechanisms to do with the body and to do with domesticity, and that in lots of writing, in the kind of social realist mode, dads do this, dads do that in literature and elsewhere, and I've always thought, what about the other stuff? Why, in the conventional model, are men absent from the changing of the nappies or the cooking of the dinner or whatever, and there's a reason, there's economic and social reasons for that I've wanted to interrogate. Also, the language that men use and is used about men seems to me to give everybody a sort of easy pass emotionally, that you're sort of suspended from an emotional interrogation about the nuances of your behavior and your language because you're doing whatever the kind of late capitalist scenario encourages you to be doing. And one of the things that results in for me is a great lack of ambition about in male company about what we might talk about and what we might achieve as people. It results in these sort of strange pre-established linguistic and social rituals, often to do with work or sport, or these sort of template-ready bits of information that men exchange. And I find it hilarious and baffling and ripe for satire a lot of the time. Like I often get trapped in these conversations and feel like, come on, buddy, that's enough. Let's talk. How's the wife? How are the kids? All right, oh, it's hard, isn't it? So, oh, you're still with the Citroen, I see. Like, yeah, I still drive a Citroen, you fucking but an attempt to sort of get past that, but also credit people with a depth of feeling, but also recapture, I think, from some of feminist discourse, and feminist theory, perhaps separately to that, a psychological complexity of child rearing and also loss, particularly, I think, grief and loss for boys, for boyhood. Partly that comes from now, very culturally conservative times in the UK at the moment, but also relatively, like, in our diagnostic tools, even about things like toxic masculinity, we leap to the buzzword. It's a bit like the diversity drive in publishing. It's sort of economically determined tokenism. So all the time we leap to a buzzword. We've got a mental health crisis, and that's sort of where it ends. You might start a charity, you might do some funding, you might come up with a smart logo or some badges, but actually the work that's done to look at the level of the language, at the level of education, the level of social injustice, why is it that some boys aren't reading, and what happens to those boys, and of course the data maps exactly. They underperform in the job market, they underperform educationally, they usually turn into, drug users or alcohol dependent people or domestic abusers. Like that is exact. And rather than deal with that in a systemic or structural level or at a funding level, the ideological decisions are to just sort of put that problem over there. And so I wanted to kind of, in all these books, just play with that. I'm not an essayist. I'm not an anthropologist. It's not like I can map these models, but I want to have that, one of the tools of the novelist, isn't it? Ambivalence, to restore the sort of charged ambiguity about male behavior back to it. And often with the study of boyhood, and particularly for this book, realize that what we deem as the kind of society's no-hopers, or people as a supposed dead end, are in fact incredibly sophisticated and capable of innate and intuitive development between them in the ecosystem. So to always go to trees, but that's my tendency. But in the nutrient system of the boyhood in an institution, a crucially progressive institution like this, which has been defunded and shut now, mainly in the UK, they're achieving between them really very sophisticated ways of discussing gender and race and violence and trauma. And the book doesn't have a trauma plot. I never tell you what happened to Shai, if at all, that would make him behave in this way. But that the boys are asking, and they're not using diagnostic language, they're not using pharmaceutical tropes or anything. They're listening to one another over time. And that's the crucial thing, is you let time do its extraordinary work, and you allow things like the architectural uncanny or the incredibly politically charged space of the English class system. You let those things happen, and out of it, language will emerge that is, to my mind at least, a more productive discussion of masculinity than the question of what are we going to do about Andrew Tate? Like, what are we going to do about Andrew Tate? But even a book like this is really interesting. Like, male reviewers rush to label this book sentimental in a way I find hugely alarming. Because sentimentality, by definition, is an excess of tenderness, but the alternatives have failed us quite profoundly. It's a joke, I think. I don't find it very funny, but it's a good review. But the guy says at the end, Seinfeld's no hugging review is not followed at the end of this book. I'm like, well, no. It's a progressive educational establishment to rehabilitate young boys who've all done very violent and difficult things. And one of them has just tried to take his own life and then destroyed a listed building and is standing in his underpants on a lawn. There is not a no-hugging rule in that situation. It's a carefully calibrated professional response to touch, as midwives have, as palliative carers have. So to see that as some kind of failing of masculinity on my part as a novelist is bonkers. Yeah. Like, it's really weird. And I think it possibly, from the feminist point of view, derives from... I used to read a lot of Klaus Teweleit. Did you read him? Mm-mm. He's a theorist of that pre-World War... one fire corps, that kind of we are stronger as a team, proto-fascistic, fuck the world language, but also militaristic thinking about the weakness of the individual and the strength of the team and all this stuff. And he's hugely influential and worrying and very Andrew Tate. And so I think that even if the critical culture itself is borrowing that language, it's a little bit like how you discussed with the Christina Sharp interview that is so extraordinary on David's podcast, but this question of leaning back into the brutality of fact again and again, even when you're purporting to investigate it on a podcast, on a TV show with a government initiative about mental health, you are in fact simply reinforcing it again and again and again, potentially even exacerbating it. So I was sort of delighted to see the verdict of the book confirmed in these reviews that suggest it's somehow soft. Or even, weirdly, because there's almost a sort of anti-intellectualism and misogyny sort of weirdly work hand in hand. So there's almost a sort of whiff of homophobia about this. It's almost as if I'm being weak or failing the kind of virile tradition of the literary novelist in discussing these subjects by allowing things such as touch or compassion in, which is interesting and worrying. Yeah.
Well, since we're speaking about critical response and since this is one of your few North American stops, tell us about America versus Britain in this regard. I remember with Lanny that you'd mentioned that the main character in America was often diagnosed, even though there's nothing stated in Lanny saying he has a diagnosis. He was often referred to as on the spectrum in some fashion, as being autistic or on the spectrum. He was
called autistic, yeah.
And not in the UK. But I also know in the UK, for instance with Lanny, the figure of the green man is something that most Americans are not familiar with. And this book is set in mid-90s England. Probably we share some aspects. I know if we imagine Last Chance, Home for Troubled Boys getting defunded, I don't think that's hard for Americans to understand. But I guess I'm curious about two things. One, is there something you'd want to orient an American readership to that maybe wouldn't be obvious, similar to The Green Man? And are there ways in which you're seeing the book framed that are particularly American?
I guess I would take as an example, and this didn't occur to me until the book came out, there's a thing in the book called the ha-ha. How many of you would know what a ha-ha is? English. You lived there for a bit, yeah. So often in big manor houses or country estates, the lawn has an edge where they've built a sort of 3 or 4 foot high wall, and it was to keep cattle out. I've been pushed off a ha-ha at Benjamin Disraeli's country estate, where we went with my mother-in-law for a walk, and my little nephew or someone just shoved me off it. And there's a scene in the book where they all joke about, because of the ha-ha, and a child is violently attacked and left bleeding on the other side of the ha-ha, and the question is asked, why did no one see that he was there? And they all joke because of the ha-ha. But it is a status symbol, and it is something that only the rich could afford, and it is a dividing line. And it's the dividing line in the book between the mythic realm that Shai slips into during his escapade and the world, the material world of the house and the institution and the teachers and the pedagogical imperatives at work there. And so these sorts of dividing lines are a form of specificity in the work to do with England, particularly to do with the class system, but also to do with that. We'll maybe get onto this, but one of the reasons the book is set in 1995, before the New Labour moment, where a long period of Conservative rule had done certain types of damage to certain types of people. You know, I say it's ideologically determined. It really is, and the symptoms of it are really easy to trace. So joblessness, but also economic deprivation in coastal areas, economic deprivation in inner city areas, particularly in the north. The north is starved economically, and so on and so forth. These are things that Conservative governments repeatedly achieve. It would be a badge of honour for a Conservative government to make these achievements, and yet again they've done it. And so I suppose that an American reader might not be so attuned to them, but the general picture would be familiar, I think. The diagnostic stuff, because I read that Richard Reeves book on boys, I think it's called On Boys and Men, and it's about the American, it's a book written about America, where the problem is so much more exacerbated by, you know, the incarceration system. And it's not an abolitionist book at all in some rather alarming ways. But the statistics are comparable, and he talks about the UK quite a lot, and talks about the white working class in the UK, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting in terms of the data, which is unarguable, and it's interesting in his attempts to say I'm not belittling or ignoring some of the broader problems, i.e. the history of institutional sexism, almost something, but these are parallel problems, and perhaps we ought to think more carefully about the way they are the same problem and the way they are organically tied. So I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I guess it comes down to the line, like the specificity usually with Lanny, the more I worked on it being a British, so the overheard material in Lanny, the pulling of the pints, the jokes, the level of immigration to that village, the history of the church, the mythic stuff, I felt that the more specific I made it, the more chance, weirdly, it had of travelling. Whereas if you try and make something generic or universal, it's just less good, and the goodness should be the thing with literature. That should be what we're paying attention to. Yeah. With this one, I'm not so sure, because the drum and bass stuff and I broke Hilary Mantel's rule in this book of taking all the research out. It's about a teenage boy, and the culture is brag. And the culture is extreme specificity about which DJs you love, which ones you've seen play live, who was the MC that night, was it a tape or a CD, have you got the label, etc. And so Shai is all show. And that, I was joking earlier with Patrick about my American cousins coming over from DC. And even in their first utterance, like, we want to hear about drum and bass, we're like, oh, so embarrassing. You don't know anything about drum and bass. Like that, the kind of extreme snobbery that any kind of tribal behavior engenders, particularly with music, particularly in the pre-digital era. You could spot Shai, 50 yards down the road and tell you what type of music he was in, because it was all on the body. One of the things I've learned from mentoring young people with these books, and one of the things that I feel so ill-equipped to understand about the present, is that the stuff is no longer visible. Like, young people these days laughed at me when I said, but you all wear tracksuit bottoms and trousers exactly in Nike Air Force, exactly the same. And they were like, because our styling, our cultural styling is done online. So we've all got wildly different identities if you look at our snaps and you look at our Insta. I don't know. I don't even know what they're doing. But whereas we did it on the body. So I think maybe those sorts of things, there's more of a slippage between the American and US edition this time. And yet, American reviewers have engaged much more with how that's done in the language of the book. The sort of bombardment that Shai is in, the weather system in which he moves, social, political, colossal anxiety, very, very violent bullying, these sorts of things. The way that I've done that as a series of juxtapositional collage elements is much more understood by the American reviewer as a literary tactic to try and get at something emotional. So maybe the specificity is in fact a block, because English reviewers will go on about it's Lynx Africa, it's 1995, he listens to tapes, and that's actually, of course, not the point. Yeah. Those are the surface things.
Well, you've described yourself as childlike, and your books are all playful in a whole bunch of different ways. Some of your influences include poetry, comics, theater, music in this book, and you see your use of the visual, the way things are laid out on the page, the use of white space, the attention to syntax. And then I think with comics also, the way you play with the size of the fonts, changing fonts. So when we're thinking about playfulness and the way you have characters in your previous books that sort of hold the space of both the non-human and something outside of language beyond what you're doing formally. So the crow and dead Papa Toothwort. There doesn't really seem to be that force in the same way. I mean, there is, I won't speak into some things that I think would be spoilers, but in a way it feels like we get all of these voices. There's a sort of mystery, I think, between the way your books are really small and also very spare, but are read in a way that feel very maximalist and abundant. Like there's an overflowing of voices. There's an overflowing of sensation. There's an overflowing of the musicality of the language. And sometimes the words literally can't be contained by the dimension of a page. But Shai doesn't seem to have someone to talk to the way in your first two books you have these non-natural voices. And so in a way he feels adrift within this sort of maximal sea of other people's voices. And the music, in a weird way, feels like maybe is the refuge, the non-connotative refuge within sort of a sea of everyone else's words. And I don't know if this isn't really a question, but I guess I wanted to hear whether you recognize something about Shai in that description.
I think that my tendency to go to the mythic or the non-human was a way of speaking more accurately to human concerns before, particularly from the sort of voyeuristic point of view, but also potentially from a sort of cathartic or even sort of a philosophical overview of humanity that might yield something for the present. So that's what Dead Papa Toothwort's doing. That's what Crow is doing. He's known humans back and back. So I guess there's sort of trickster mentality there from a literary point of view. And this book, I didn't want to afford Shai anything like that. I had to get me out of that and my techniques out of that and to create his extraordinary loneliness. But I realized that in order to portray this loneliness and indeed his despair, there's no getting around it. Shai is heading to the pond with a backpack of rocks. You don't need to have read a lot of Virginia Woolf to know what he's going to do. And I think that what I found was that without the music, it was impossible to create a credible emotional state for him, because despair on its own felt too much like me essaying around him as a literary invention. He was saying to me, but this isn't it, because despair and ecstasy are so tethered. And so one of the things that he became so much more real to me when I gave him the music, and he suddenly became really nothing to do with me, was because that refuge that the music affords him, but also that it is in his body, that it is his two-step mentality, it is his baseline, and it is his ornamentation. It is the patterning of his selfhood in a way that is unimaginable when you're out of it, looking back at teenage obsessions with music. It becomes him. And I was really keen to find out the thing that becomes him in the same way as the village becomes Dead Papa Toothwort or Dead Papa Toothwort becomes the child. That interchangeability. And then the reason, with no spoilers, the reason that there is a mythic interruption was because of the preoccupation really with the everyday miracle of another consciousness acting upon him, and the sheer good fortune of that, but also the possibility for all of us that can occur. That if you are paying attention, there are crows, there are Dead Papa Toothworts, there are mythic undertows, and there are also, I mean, I never spell this out in the book, of course, because it would be really naff, and everyone, the alarm would go off that this is a Max Porter book. But that the membrane between the human and the non-human is thin. What we're attuned to, what our attention is dialed up to be receptive to, is an incredibly narrow, as indigenous cultures knew and as scientists are now finding out again, is an incredibly narrow amount. You know, my obsession, you've probably heard me talking about this, but the golden mole that Kate Rundle wrote so beautifully about this year, that there is this mole that is iridescent, like a hummingbird's throat, but this mole lives underground and is blind. So it's evolutionarily a puzzle why it would still have this capability, even though it can't be used. And it's because of its fur and the incredible softness and receptiveness of its fur. But what she reveals at the end of this piece is that humans also glow. We glow, but our retinas aren't dialed up enough to see it. And so that's what's happening with Shy. And I suppose that takes the function of the Dead Papa Toothwort and the crow, is just to show him this extraordinary range outside his current perception of what he is both capable of and doesn't need to know he's capable of. And I suppose it's a tiny little bit of an homage to Slaughterhouse-5 in that regard. You know, when the Tremalphodons come down, you know, but just that sense of abject failure and shame not to have anything to offer them. But what you realize when you go back through Shy, and when Shy goes back through that night, is how much he does know about music and about the 60-million-year-old Flint that Steve's told him about, and about his friends, and about his place in the culture, and about his shame, and about his parents. And actually, he's been soaking up information the entire time he's been screaming. And I suppose I just wanted to give, if I'd had a mythic device, it would have been less of a gift to Shy, to realize that he has that capability within him already.
Well, staying with this notion of what happens when he's confronted with another consciousness, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your contract with the reader as the other consciousness in this book, because this book feels very, contrary to what I just said, I think both of these things are true. It feels very maximalist, but it feels very distilled. And I feel like I can feel all of the work that has been written and then pulled out of the book. And you've said that, I don't know if it's related to what you've pulled out, but you know, there's not exposition in the book, there's not backstory in the book, but you've said you wanted each reader to create their own Shy. And I imagine this sort of excavation that happened as like a space for the reader's consciousness to go in and sort of co-create the book with you. And this is my one really random thing, because it made me think, and this has nothing to do with the book, but I'm going to read this just to see if this sparks anything for you. But it made me think of this interview with the French director Jean-Luc Godard, and he's talking about the difference between cinema and television. Of course, this is before the internet, so before streaming, but I'm just going to read his quotes, and then I want to hear if this at all relates to you, for you. So he says, with cinema, you look up. With television, you look down. On TV, there is no projection. There is a rejection. You are rejected in your armchair or on your bed. In pictures, you are projected, but you still have to decide what to be. In TV, there is just transmission of something. It's peculiar to cinema to project, yes. And then he says, cinema generates memory, television, oblivion. And somehow I feel like in pictures you are projected, but you still have to decide what to be, feels connected to your books, to me. And I wondered if if there's any resonance for you around that.
Well, I like that as well, because someone, maybe Sam Harris actually talked a little bit about the cinema as a metaphor for the mind, that you are in the film, but of course you are only still in a black box in a building and it's daytime outside.
Yeah.
And I liked that as an analogy for the engagement with the work of art of any kind, especially where we're in the age where we're interrogating the institutional framework of the encounter a lot. And I have done in my book about Francis Bacon is a little bit about that. So yes, with the book as, to use another cinematic reference, the Eisenstein montage quote that I've so fixated about in John Burge's telling of it, of the juxtapositional energy of a sequence, and that the gap between two still images is where meaning resides, and it's like the hinge of a metaphor. And that's slightly dated because I don't think you could put modern streaming TV into that formulation, right? He's talking about the TV as was in the 20th century. So, I think, yes, that's it. There wasn't really a question, was there? You just wanted me to say, yeah.
But I'm gonna.
Absolument, oui. I think the absence of exposition is a way of crediting your reader with enough cultural baggage, enough books they've read, TV shows they've seen, films they've seen, life they've lived, to not need to spoon feed them. And I've spoken in a way about this, the tradition of the social realist novel as being a sort of relying on certain expositionary strategies and that being patronizing. It's not. It's just the way the novel developed, and that, from its 19th century peak, as it were, through genre and through fantasy and everything. And some people have done it brilliantly, of course. Masterpieces have emerged from that scaffolding and from the way that's filled in. But I guess I've always felt that the ongoing experience, that the ripple effect of poetry, of what happens in a reader's mind when you gift them images when they've stopped reading, and that's not credited to the author. I suppose it's a sort of authorless thing, that the author is off the pedestal. You just, like Joyce Carol Oates said that thing recently about her, the sheer size of her oeuvre, and she was like, well, it's all the work, and read bits. If you don't have to read it all, read the ones that interest you. Some will be good, some will be bad. But this sense that you just leave the work and people will find it. I'd like to just leave my books lying around and people will find them. But that, what I'm therefore saying to the reader is unfixed, unfinished, fluid. The white space is an invitation for you to think in this. And especially if we're thinking about, a volatile atom. And the membrane, I'm not a cellular biologist, but the cell itself only becomes alive when the membrane around it is charged. That's a planetary thing as well as every single thing that is made up of anything in this world, from the stars to our cells, requires that charge. And I feel the same about the work. I can't dictate the charge that you bring to it. You are the membrane between it and the world, and you will bring your own psychosexual, political, religious, spiritual heritage to it, and that charge will be profoundly different. And that excites me rather than frustrates me. But I meet writers for whom that's a terrifying failure on their part or source of chronic anxiety, because they want meaning, they want to control meaning. But I think to do that with other books, definitely, but with something like Shy, the proposition of an unhappy person who is preventing being reached by traditional linguistic means has to be something that you finish yourself.
Yeah.
I suppose the ambivalence built into the proposition of a novel in that way, they're like ambivalence machines to me, novels. And therefore, in the same way that cinema, that has to be something you look up into from a position of mindful. It's a bit like, again, sorry, just 'cause I'm listening to it right now, it's a bit like Christina Sharp talking about the making of beauty. It's an active thing. You have to actively come to this book and think about it. It's not prescriptive or didactic in any way, I hope. And there was one bit in the first draft, because I wrote Steve another 20,000 words, I wrote the mother another 20,000 words, I shuffled them, I played them, and I realized I'd taken all the energy out of Shy. It had much more energy when I left it alone. And there was one bit, and I gave it to a great writer called Samantha Harvey, who I saw in here earlier. She wrote an amazing book called The Sleepless Unease, which is about insomnia. She's a really extraordinary and underappreciated stylist in the UK. She said, well, it's great. I love Shy. It upset me. She likened it to Mrs. Dalloway in terms of the consciousness, all very nice. And she said, but there's one scene. And before she even said what the scene was, I knew what she was going to refer to. And it was when I had said what was wrong with Shy. The omnipotent narrator came in and said, because he'd done this thing, he felt this way. And of course, once it's pointed out to you, it's crushingly terrible and appalling. But I can see, looking back in a kind of analytical sense, why I had done that was because I hadn't trusted my reader, or I had felt that I needed to predict or control their emotional response to it, which is fraudulent and you'd often just call that bad writing.
Well, before we go to a Q&A, I did get one question from Twitter from the novelist Megan Barker, who has a book kit coming out, and I discovered that your blurb is on this book, actually. And
before I stop blurbing.
But I'm going to join her question to something I'm curious about and sort of make a hybrid question for you. So to me, Shy seems trapped in the present tense. There's no past, there's no future, there's no reflection in the book. It sort of barrels forward. It's full of a lot of interjections until he finds himself in the forest. And only there, it feels like, does the book sort of enact a continuity of thought where you can, what it feels to me like, settle into Shy's body as the protagonist. And it made me think of a Jory Graham line about deep time. The practice of imagining the deep future is a mirroring activity of imagining the deep past. And it feels like that's something that happens when he gets away from all of these other voices. And also makes me wonder if this is the one area that is really an ailment that we're all suffering from, and it's not Shy specific. But Megan wonders, and this is a paraphrase, so this isn't a quote, but so her question's about animism. And her curiosity is how we reshape our sense of what it means to be human, to change how we perceive, to re-enter deep time would be my language, not only when we're alone and meditative, but among other voices and in the world. So if you have any thoughts on animism, whether they're related to time, I know that that's something of interest to you and interest of all these books.
Yeah, good question. Both. Thanks for marrying them together so skillfully. I mean, Shy, I wanted to give him retrocognition and precognition. The book is a sort of hauntological animist proposition, and Shy is at various times in it a sort of proto-mystic. He doesn't realize he's having epiphanies that might actually be world-changingly important epiphanies until a dead animal speaks to him. I think the study of deep time, as someone like Jory Graham has repeatedly told us in such startling lyric formulations, is simultaneously profoundly cathartic and existentially devastating for the human project. And that's one of the reasons why we don't do it. That's one of the reasons why we can't connect it with our lived experience, is because it's inexplicable. It's too much. So Shy has a backpack full of rocks, but he's learned from one of his teachers that one of them is 60 million years old. And we know that fact is going to do something to a consciousness like Shy's. It's going to startle or terrify him in equal measure, or maybe connect to the project of taking his own life in ways that we might not be able to predict because it's hugely personal. I have a rock in my rock collection that is Lewisian gneiss, geologist in the room. Gneiss. It's 30,000 million years old. And to hold something in your hand, it presents you with cosmic, irreconcilable vastnesses within you that are irritating and bleach for all of us into unexpected places. Crippling anxiety, violence. One can react violently to that information because it's like, don't give a caged animal a terrifying, clarifying piece of information like that, but also the spiritual. And for me, the fundamental animist proposition that other things beyond the human have personhood is such a corrective to the artificial, to supremacy of the Homo sapien anyway, but also to the violence that we have done to ourselves in such a short space of time, and that we've done to the planet in such a short space of time. So I think, to answer Megan's question, one of the things one might do is make interventions at times like this, crucially at times like this, rather than to the more receptive, to the keen to learn kindergarten kid, or to the already converted, peaceful human beings we find growing next to us in the forest, to arm a person with that humbling sense of themselves in relationship to others. Because what we've got to stop doing, I think, in my view, is having these epiphanies too late in the game. And I felt this with my first book. One of the things that happened, I saw someone being interviewed. It was like Michael, who's the guy that wrote Moneyball? Lewis, yeah. He was on TV talking about the tragic death of his daughter. And he said, so I got to the age of 65 and had this terrible thing and realized there was this planet of the grieving. And I joined them and loved them and knew them and felt welcomed by them. And I thought, wonderful, but also extraordinary, that you have such a type of intelligence, but you have such a colossal absence of intelligence in this other area that it's taken you to be 65 before you realize that we're all in pain. Like, and I remember my brother saying this, where there was some bully in the school, and I was like, what the fuck is that guy's problem? And my brother's like, he's probably never lost anyone. And it was a razor-sharp analysis of my 9-year-old brother. Because all he was saying is he doesn't have our superpower, which is loss, which is pain. Because what it grows in you, what it germinates in you, is this capacity to take yourself down to it. And you know, and we find again and again and again, you know, that's why Amitav Ghosh's book, The Curse of the Nutmeg, is so world-changingly brilliant in my view, because it reminds us that that's why colonialism and environmentalism and the environmental crisis are one and the same thing, because they are this act of deafness to our interdependency. And people get to their deathbeds, this is what I mean about Michael Lewis, they get to their deathbeds, and you know, that amazing study at Harvard, tacos, Harvard, of the Happiness Project. And you know, as if we should be surprised by this. Of course, people on their deathbeds don't talk about wealth or success or their Amazon reviews or whether they got a blurb from George Saunders. They talk about their relationships. We are relational. We are interdependent species living and sharing nutrients. And therefore, the Wood Wide Web discoveries have been so profound for me, because not just because it's incredible that trees are altruistic, but more than that, more refreshingly and useful for our purposes as educators of one another, of keepers of different forms of information and communicative strategies, is that they're also jealous and confrontational and selfish. And, you know, species eradications happens all the time. So we've got to stop romanticizing this idea of the animist proposition and actually use it to survive. Like, it's a survival mechanism. We cannot do this with gadgetry. We cannot do it by flying to Mars or doing Twitter events with Ron DeSantis. Like, that's not how we're going to be able to do it. But the problem is that capitalism is so entrenched, the caged animal is so violent that every attempt gets belittled. And that's why the accusation of sentimentality actually delights me. Because sentimental is the fucking first step. We're going all the way. We're going to actually have to love one another. You know, that's why Rebecca Solnit's new work about hope, after such an extraordinary career as someone spreading the gospel of anxiety and fear, she's way ahead of us. Because hope is going to be the doctrine, you know, it's going to be technologically, it's going to be not just you're a hippie, you're mad, you're sentimental, you're compassionate, grow up, stop being so naive. All the things that the screaming teenager is saying, that's not right. It's not right. And so I think this sort of collective going backward to what we knew before and what we've unlearned. You know, Shai's bafflement at adult life, you know, are we going to end up like his stepdaddy and just playing golf and worrying about his gutters and buying his car? He's right. It's extremely strange. And it's extremely strange from a spiritual point of view as well as a practical one, because there's work to do. And if Shai's frightened of that work and wants to bail, this is a completely non-judgmental book, and it's coming from a position of understanding that at a species level as well as an individual level. And I think some of that connecting where we are as individuals, that's why Brexit was such a heartbreak to me, because it's such a daft mentality. And it has been so counterproductive and so detrimental to our species so many times in the past. So to repeat that mistake, knowing what we now know, it is enraging. So I've rambled, I'm sorry, but it's the ugliest book of mine so far, but I hope that it's in the baseline concealed within it, of hope and generosity to one another, makes it my most loving book so far as well.
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you, Max Porter.
Thanks, Dave.
So we're recording this. So if you're okay being in the recording for the podcast, you can come up and I'll give you the microphone and ask a question. And if you're not okay being in the recording, you can just ask a question from your seat. So if you consent to potentially being in it, you can come up and I'll hand you the microphone if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, you guys, for the lovely, astute conversation. This is a little bit of a simpler question, but piggybacking on you're talking about being on your deathbed, and we come down to all relationships, and also your interest in collaboration. I'm really curious, in this oeuvre of boyhood, how you have been influenced by, or maybe in conversation with your children as you work on those books. Like, are they active participants, or how do you have conversations in your mind in regards to parenting and there being active participants in your life?
Beautiful, thanks. I think one of the things I've been struck by is the temporal aspect to it all, that Monday's crisis can't be resolved on Monday and will look very different on Tuesday. And I'm a very impatient person, so I've found that to be quite a profound realization. Also, I'm married to someone that is very patient and is therefore fundamentally a better parent than I am. But we make quite a good team because I'm all explosive panic and she's a calm, wise, intuitive person. And you need a bit of both maybe sometimes. I had a thing recently when my eldest son, who's glued to his mobile phone, as many people his age are, as many people as full stop are, and he started telling me about something very unpleasant, conspiracy theory, and I erupted. I was really angry and shocked because it was a devastating thing to hear my child coming out with this stuff. And of course, it was the terrible mistake that people in this book make and that we make and that I've observed other people making, which is I didn't let him finish. What he was in fact going to tell me was that it was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory and how shocking that was, and he'd been reading about it. And the poor kid, it's not like he was just looking at shit on YouTube. He was reading like History Today magazine article about, the pernicious longevity of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and he was just going to talk to me about it. And I flew off the handle and said, "You're not having your mobile phone anymore. I knew this would happen, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to put a Google block on." What's a Google block? I don't know. I'm going to talk to my close personal friend, Musk, about this. But what it taught me was that some of the insights I'm gaining as a writer in relation to made-up people in my books, I'm not applying to my own life. And I found that interesting and clarifying. One of the things, again, perhaps I've done better in my writing life than I have in my real life, is the absence of comparative thinking, comparative parenting. You have to pay attention to the line you're in, right? You have to make the books more themselves. It's such a fool's errand to, and writers of all stages do it, but you're writing and then you read the new Jory Graham and you're like, damn, I'm not as good as Jory Graham, and various imitative things would creep in that you'd be trying to make your work more like Jory Graham or whatever. So I really think with my children, I've worked incredibly hard to think of them as individuals and to not apply moral panics or diagnostic language or cause and effect thinking or cure. I'm not trying to cure these children. I'm trying to let them be, and I've learned that slowly. I think also with boys, this sense that they are just in this linguistically and behaviourally, that they are in this pickle that we've got them, and the kind of boomer mentality also, like, so we fucked it, so you're gonna have to fix it, which is so dangerous and is such a counterproductive mentality to give to young people, because it's giving them a problem before they've even had a chance to make their own problems, of course. And until we make our own problems, we can't devise ways to fix them. So I think I've been really attuned to the ways that they won't be worried about the same things I'm worried about. And they won't have the same language I have for that concern. And that every generation of parents realize that as well, I suppose, don't they? Sometimes too late. When they were younger, I worried that they didn't draw. And so I did this sort of ridiculous panicked dash to Hobbycraft and bought, more pens and more pencils. And of course, that's not what makes them draw. But if I leave the paper around, sure enough, they'll draw. And even if they weren't drawing, I'm sure they're doing something else. And so like the trust economy that I've put so much freight in as a writer, trusting my collaborators, trusting my readers, why have I not applied the same to my children, who of course have turned out wildly different than I expected and super cool and interesting and, yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm learning. I also think, not having a dad and realizing through this work and through like going to palliative care conferences to deliver lectures and stuff, I realized the extent to which we trap our parents, dead or alive, in narrative frameworks that serve our purposes, like day-to-day emotional purposes or also longer-term political or spiritual purposes, and how cruel and unimaginative that is to them. Like I make a point of, like the kids in my first book say, we were careful to name her Granny when Dad became Granddad. The sense always, and it's a hauntological thing, I think, of just there are ghosts in the room, and we are remiss if we don't remember that. The idea that we are here and that even the lived present is this sort of privileged point of view. Like we have to think of the scores, decades, billions behind us, and that might help us think more fruitfully about the people that are to come. And I think that works as a model agriculturally. I think it works as a model politically. The capitalist fetishization of the present profit over long-term gain is bizarre and frightening, and it's nothing like having children to clarify that, I suppose.
First, I wanted to say, I don't know how you do it as a parent, write books that when you pick them up, you immediately are like, I can't put this down because I'm going to go to bed traumatized if this kid dies. Like, how do you do that? But also, I was curious. I read this, and I loved when Lanny asked, which do you think is more patient, an idea or hope? And I noticed that in this book, and then as you've been talking about your other books, a lot of your writing has to do with time and how you use that on your pages. Obviously, you're very artistic with how you do that. I love that. But what would you say? How would you answer that question? What do you think is more patient?
Well, I'd answer that question because I wrote that question as a question that would annoy Robert at 3 a.m. So often people quote that and say, like, if you like books where people say shit like this to each other. I'm like, no. People don't say shit like this to each other in this book. One child says that at one point in his stressed dad's life, when the dad's got to get up in 3 hours, and it's a way of throwing into sort of shocked crisis that relationship which is malfunctioning, between Lanny and his father. But I do think it's kind of a cool question. I suppose it's like one of those riddles that doesn't really have an answer. But I have come to realize that it's the same, right? That what people often call hope in a lazy way of something that is tethered to the future, it's a bit like forgiveness needing both parts, right? So you can't just make an apology, it has to be heard. And so the radical act of forgiving oneself or being forgived requires the apology to be heard and accepted, right? And that requires in itself faith. And so hope requires faith. You can't just have hope notionally. It has to be built on or connected organically to a foundation of onward belief. And that, to me, is what ideas are. They are gestures into the shared space. So if I wasn't a sleep-deprived city banker at 3 a.m. losing his temper with his son, I think I would want to sit down and talk about, because I think, again, it's just like this tyranny of hope as a framework that we irresponsibly slide to younger generations. Literally, right? We're like, oh, you'll come up with a tidal energy form, or you'll somehow unpick yourself from the way that these phones have enslaved you all and like created a mental health disaster the scale of which we could never have imagined even 10 or 15 years ago. Gotta have hope. Like, hope. I remember during the pandemic, my neighbors wrote hope in big letters on their wall, and I was like, why hope? Like, vaccines, like global cooperation between nations to ensure vaccine equality, but hope, I'm not sure. But then good conversations with my kids who are like, I think what it means is like hope that people will do exactly that. Like, everyone's hope's different, Dad. And I was like, all right, you brilliantly clever little guy. Yeah. So, I don't know, but I like that you would ask it. But also the terror is the thing, right? The anxiety, the crippling, is what I was saying about grief earlier, the crippling uncertainty, the restlessness to address with as much exactitude as we possibly can the various different crises that we are in, personally and as a group, that refusal to settle on pre-existing ideas of solution or even cause and effect that's when you have ideas. Is in the crisis, is in the difficulty. So it's a bit like the question of, is difficult poetry worth persevering? Because it is on your second or third attempt to a difficult thing that hope or clarification does emerge. So they'd be manifestos for, a bit like, I always call them in the UK anti-tabloid devices, books, because the reproduction and regurgitation of existing narratives of bigotry or xenophobia or racism it's just the unexamined light. It's just a pure junk product being sold to the the lowest common denominator just for the recycling profit. And what hope and complex crisis conversations and pain and healing, what those things allow is progress for us all as thinking, feeling beings.
Well, sadly, we're getting the signal we're out of time. But I hope...
What's the signal? I didn't see it. For our listeners. Oh, it's a beautiful modern dance. Only at Powell's.
I hope you'll come back to Portland again. Let's give a big round of applause to Max Porter.
Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find out more about Max Porter's work at maxporter.co.uk. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing for the conversation, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive, which includes Max's reading of the poem he wrote for the singer-songwriter Joan Shelley, the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, to a bundle of books selected by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Jay Nichelle in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog e Sapatita Mi, can be found on iTunes. Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.